Grand Rapids, Michigan, December 1985. A city blanketed in snow where Christmas decorations lit up downtown, where families crowded into toy stores searching for the year's most popular gifts, and where the Cabbage Patch Kids craze had parents desperate to find the dolls their children begged for in letters to Santa. The Langston family lived on Lafayette Avenue in a two-story colonial house, and David worked as an engineer at a manufacturing company, while Helen taught second grade at an elementary school, and they had two children, Owen, who was 10, and Mira, who was 6. Mira had curly brown hair that bounced when she ran, bright brown eyes that always seemed to be smiling, and an outgoing personality that made her the center of attention wherever she went, always talking, always laughing, always making friends with everyone she met. She had been begging for a Cabbage Patch Kid doll for months, had circled it in every toy catalog, had told Santa at the mall, and Helen had been searching every store in Grand Rapids trying to find one before Christmas. And finally, Woodland Mall's Toy Palace had called saying they received a shipment. On Saturday, December 14th, 1985, Helen took Owen and Mira to Woodland Mall at 10 in the morning, and the mall was packed with holiday shoppers, children lined up to see Santa, and Christmas music played over speakers while artificial snow fell from the ceiling in the central atrium. They went directly to Toy Palace on the second floor, and the store was crowded with parents and children, and Helen found a sales clerk who brought out a box of Cabbage Patch Kids, and Mira was ecstatic choosing one with brown yarn hair and a pink dress that she immediately named Rosie. Helen paid for the doll and several other gifts, and they walked through the mall looking at window displays, and around 11:15, Helen said they would stop at the food court for lunch before going home, and they rode the escalator down to the first floor. The food court was crowded, and Helen told Owen and Mira to find a table while she waited in line at McDonald's, and the children walked ahead carrying shopping bags, and Mira clutched her new Cabbage Patch doll against her chest, talking to it as if it were real. Owen found a table near the center of the food court, and he sat down with the shopping bags, and Mira said she needed to use the bathroom, and Owen said it was just around the corner near the entrance, and Mira walked away still carrying Rosie the doll. After about 10 minutes, Helen arrived at the table with food, and she asked Owen where Mira was, and Owen said she had gone to the bathroom, and Helen said that was too long, and she walked to the bathroom and went inside calling Mira's name. Mira was not in any of the stalls, and Helen asked other women in the bathroom if they had seen a little girl with curly brown hair carrying a doll. But no one had, and Helen's voice grew panicked as she ran back to Owen, asking if he was sure Mira had gone to the bathroom. Owen said yes, he had watched her walk in that direction, and Helen searched the food court looking at every table, checking the nearby stores, and she asked security for help, and within minutes, mall security was searching and making announcements over the PA system. If this happened in your neighborhood, wouldn't you want to know how it was finally solved? Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel, and if you'd like to follow more mysteries finally solved through DNA, consider subscribing to the DNA archives, where every day we uncover another truth time tried to hide. The bathroom Mira had walked toward had two entrances, one from the food court and one from a corridor leading to the parking garage, and security checked surveillance footage and saw Mira enter the bathroom at 11:22, but never saw her exit through the food court entrance. Security checked the parking garage entrance and found footage showing Mira leaving the bathroom through that door at 11:25, and a woman had been walking beside her with her hand on Mira's shoulder, and they had walked together toward the parking garage. The woman was wearing a winter coat with the hood up, sunglasses despite being indoors, and she was looking down, and her face was not visible in the footage, and she and Mira disappeared into the garage, and no footage showed them leaving because the garage cameras were malfunctioning that day. Helen called David from a mall security phone, and she called the Grand Rapids Police Department, and officers arrived within 20 minutes, and Detective Patricia Moore took lead on the case, and she was 38 years old with 16 years of experience. Moore interviewed Helen and Owen, asking when Mira was last seen, what she was wearing, if she had seemed upset or frightened, and Helen described Mira's red corduroy jumper, white turtleneck, white tights, black patent leather shoes, and the Cabbage Patch doll she was carrying. The mall was locked down with all exits monitored, and officers searched every store, every bathroom, every storage area, and they found Mira's doll abandoned in a trash can in the parking garage near the exit to 28th Street, but Mira herself was gone. Witnesses were interviewed and several people remembered seeing a woman and a child walking through the garage. But no one had thought anything was wrong. They appeared to be a mother and daughter, and the woman had been walking quickly toward a blue sedan. The case dominated Grand Rapids news that evening, and Mira's kindergarten photo showing her bright smile and curly hair appeared on television, and the story of a child vanishing from a crowded mall during Christmas shopping shocked the community. Helen appeared on television that night holding the Cabbage Patch doll that had been found in the trash, begging whoever had taken Mira to return her, describing her daughter's outgoing personality and her excitement about Christmas. And David stood beside her, unable to speak, his face showing shock and devastation. Detective Moore interviewed mall employees and security staff asking about the malfunctioning garage cameras, and she learned they had been broken for 3 weeks awaiting repair, and she wondered if the abductor had known this and had planned accordingly. She reviewed the surveillance footage repeatedly, studying the woman with Mira, trying to identify anything distinctive about her clothing, her gait, her build, but the footage was grainy, and the woman had been careful to obscure her face, and witnesses' descriptions of the blue sedan were vague. The investigation expanded immediately, with officers checking every residence and business within a 10-mile radius of Woodland Mall, with roadblocks set up on major highways, with Mira's description broadcast to police departments throughout Michigan and neighboring states. Moore investigated known child predators in the area, interviewing several individuals and checking alibis, but none owned blue sedans or had been near the mall that day, and she found no evidence connecting any of them to Mira's disappearance. Helen and David were interviewed extensively about their lives, their relationships, their finances, anyone who might want to harm them or take their child. And they mentioned Helen's best friend, Judith Carver, who had been struggling with infertility and depression. Moore interviewed Judith, who was 34, unmarried, and worked as a nurse at a Grand Rapids hospital. And Judith was devastated by Mira's disappearance, crying throughout the interview, saying Mira was like a niece to her, and she had no information about who might have taken her. Judith had been at work at the hospital during the time Mira disappeared, and her supervisor confirmed she had been on shift from 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, and Moore cleared her and moved on to other leads. Helen's parents and David's parents came to Grand Rapids to help, and the house on Lafayette Avenue filled with family who brought food and offered support, and Judith came every day after work to sit with Helen, to hold her hand, to pray with her, and to help with Owen, who was traumatized. Owen struggled enormously with guilt. He had let Mira go to the bathroom alone, had not walked with her, had not protected his little sister, and he blamed himself completely, and he developed nightmares and anxiety that would last for years. Weeks turned into months with massive searches of parks and wooded areas around Grand Rapids, with dive teams searching the Grand River, with volunteers distributing posters showing Mira's photo and the Cabbage Patch doll she had been carrying. The case went cold by spring of 1986 with no credible sightings despite national media coverage, no witnesses who could identify the woman in the surveillance footage, and no physical evidence beyond the doll found in the parking garage. Cold cases don't stay alive unless people keep remembering them, so if you want more stories like this, cases that seemed forgotten until DNA brought answers, subscribe to the DNA archives and help these stories stay alive. New investigations and discoveries are shared here every day. Helen kept Mira's bedroom exactly as it had been, with toys on the shelves, clothes in the closet, and the empty spot where Rosie the Cabbage Patch doll should have been. And she would sit in there for hours talking to Mira, praying she was alive somewhere. David threw himself into work, taking on extra projects and traveling frequently because being home was unbearable, and his relationship with Helen deteriorated as they processed grief differently. And by 1988, they were barely communicating, their marriage destroyed by Mira's disappearance. Owen grew up in the shadow of his missing sister, and he remembered the moment he had let her walk away alone, and that memory haunted him, and he became a police officer as an adult, hoping to help other families, hoping to prevent other children from vanishing the way Mira had. Judith remained Helen's closest friend through the years, visiting regularly, bringing groceries and support, helping Helen with advocacy work for missing children, and Helen often said she did not know how she would have survived without Judith's friendship and loyalty. Years passed and Mira's case became one of Michigan's most haunting unsolved child disappearances, and her face appeared on age progression posters showing what she might look like at 15, at 25, at 35, but no credible sightings ever materialized. Detective Moore retired in 2006 after 38 years in law enforcement, and Mira's case remained unsolved. The little girl who vanished from a crowded mall at Christmas, and she had never been able to give the family answers. David died in 2012 from a heart attack at age 65, and he died still wondering what had happened to his daughter, still carrying guilt that he had not been at the mall that day, that he had not protected her. Helen remained in Grand Rapids, living alone in the house on Lafayette Avenue, and she kept Mira's room unchanged, and she volunteered with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and Judith continued visiting weekly, the friendship that had sustained Helen for decades. In October 2023, 38 years after Mira disappeared, the Grand Rapids Police Department received a phone call from a woman who said her name was Mira Langston, that she had been kidnapped in 1985, and she wanted to come home. The call was transferred to Detective James Rivera, who now handled cold missing persons cases, and he listened as the woman explained she was 44 years old, had been taken from Woodland Mall when she was 6, and had lived her entire life believing a lie about who she was. The woman said she had been raised in Traverse City, Michigan, by a woman she knew as her mother, and she had always been told her father had died before she was born. But recently, while sorting through belongings after the woman's death, she had found adoption papers that did not make sense. She had found newspaper clippings about a missing girl from Grand Rapids, found a Cabbage Patch doll hidden in a storage box, found a birth certificate with the name Mira Langston, and she had realized with horror that the woman who raised her had kidnapped her. Rivera was cautious because over the decades several people had falsely claimed to be Mira Langston, but something about this woman's voice, her specific details about the Cabbage Patch doll and the mall, made him take her seriously, and he asked her to come to Grand Rapids. 2 days later, a woman walked into the Grand Rapids Police Department, and she was 44 years old with curly brown hair now streaked with gray-brown eyes that looked tired and confused, and she carried a worn Cabbage Patch doll with brown yarn hair and a faded pink dress. Rivera met with her in a private interview room, and the woman introduced herself as Mira Langston, though she said she had been called Emma Carver her entire life, and she explained that the woman who raised her was Judith Carver, who had died 3 months earlier from cancer. Rivera felt his stomach drop. Judith Carver was the name in the original case file, Helen Langston's best friend who had been interviewed and cleared, who had an alibi, who had supported the family for decades, and the possibility that she had taken Mira was devastating. Mira explained that Judith had raised her in Traverse City, about 150 miles north of Grand Rapids, and they had lived quietly with Judith working as a nurse at Munson Medical Center, and Mira had been homeschooled and kept relatively isolated. She said Judith had been loving but controlling, had limited her social interactions, had monitored her constantly, and had told her that her father had died and her mother's family had rejected them, and Mira had believed this story because she had no reason to doubt the only parent she knew. Judith had never mentioned Helen Langston or the Langston family, had never allowed Mira contact with anyone from Grand Rapids, and they had moved frequently within Traverse City, never staying in one place long enough for people to ask questions about their past. When Judith was diagnosed with terminal cancer in July 2023, she became increasingly agitated and guilty, and on her deathbed she had told Mira that she loved her, that everything she did was because she loved her, but she had not confessed or explained what she had done. After Judith died in July, Mira had been sorting through her belongings and had found a locked box in the attic, and inside were the newspaper clippings, the Cabbage Patch doll, Mira's original birth certificate, and letters Judith had written, but never sent to Helen Langston apologizing and explaining. The letters revealed that Judith had been obsessed with having a child, had suffered multiple miscarriages and failed fertility treatments, and had become increasingly depressed and desperate, and she had fixated on Mira, who called her Aunt Judy, and who seemed perfect and beautiful. Judith had planned the abduction for months, had learned the Langston family's routines, had known they went to Woodland Mall frequently, and she had waited for an opportunity, and when Helen mentioned finding Cabbage Patch dolls at Toy Palace, Judith had seen her chance. She had called in sick to work that day, had disguised herself with the hooded coat and sunglasses, and had positioned herself near the food court bathrooms, knowing families used them during lunch. And when she saw Mira walk toward the bathroom alone carrying the doll, she had followed her. She had waited in the bathroom, and when Mira came out of the stall, Judith had said there was an emergency, that Mira's mother had been hurt and needed her outside, and Mira had trusted Aunt Judy completely and had followed her through the parking garage exit. 20 years later, one overlooked fragment changed everything, and that's what we explore here. The moment science meets persistence. So if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next story where DNA finally tells the truth. A new case drops every day on the DNA archives. Judith had driven Mira to Traverse City in a blue sedan that she had borrowed from a co-worker, and she had immediately changed Mira's appearance, cutting her curly hair short and dyeing it lighter. And she had changed her name to Emma and told her they were starting a new life together. Rivera collected a DNA sample from Mira and also contacted Helen Langston, who was now 73 years old and still living in Grand Rapids, and he told her someone claiming to be Mira had come forward, and it was Judith Carver's daughter, and Helen started screaming. She could not process what Rivera was saying, that her best friend, the woman who had comforted her for 38 years, who had held her hand through decades of grief, had been the one who took Mira, and Helen collapsed and had to be taken to the hospital. The DNA results came back 2 weeks later, and Rivera called Helen from the hospital where she had been admitted for observation after the shock, and he told her the DNA confirmed with 99.9% probability that Emma Carver was Mira Langston. Her daughter was alive. Helen could not speak, could not process the dual reality that her daughter had survived but had been raised by her best friend, the woman she had trusted more than anyone, the woman who had sat in Mira's bedroom with her crying about the loss while knowing exactly where Mira was. Owen flew to Grand Rapids from Chicago where he was working as a detective, and Rivera told him the news. And Owen's reaction was rage, pure fury that Judith had taken his sister, had destroyed their family, had let him carry guilt for 38 years while she played the supportive friend. The reunion between Helen and Mira was arranged carefully with counselors present, and when Helen saw Mira for the first time in 38 years, she saw her 6-year-old daughter in the face of a 44-year-old woman, and they embraced, but the moment felt awkward and strange, decades of separation creating a chasm between them. Mira struggled to call Helen Mom because Judith had been her mother for 38 years, and she had conflicting emotions, grief for the woman who raised her, anger at the lies, confusion about her identity, and uncertainty about these strangers who were her biological family. Owen met Mira and tried to connect with his little sister, but she had no memory of him, remembered nothing before age 6 except vague fragments, and he was a stranger to her, and they sat together not knowing what to say, trying to bridge an impossible gap. Rivera began investigating how Judith had maintained the deception for 38 years, and he discovered she had obtained fake adoption papers, had told Munson Medical Center that Emma was her adopted daughter, and she had homeschooled to avoid school enrollment questions. She had deliberately chosen Traverse City because it was far enough from Grand Rapids that people would not recognize Mira from news coverage, but close enough that she could stay informed about the Langston family, and she had visited Helen regularly, maintaining the friendship while hiding Mira. The letters Judith had written revealed her tortured psychology. She had convinced herself she was rescuing Mira, that Helen did not appreciate how special Mira was, that she would be a better mother, and she had rationalized the kidnapping as an act of love rather than the crime it was. She had also written about the guilt that consumed her, about watching Helen suffer, about attending David's funeral knowing she had contributed to his death through the stress and grief, and about wanting to confess but being too afraid of losing Emma. Rivera discovered that Judith had been at the mall the day Mira disappeared despite claiming to be at work. Hospital records showed she had called in sick, and she had lied during the original investigation, and her alibi had been accepted because she was Helen's best friend, and investigators did not suspect her. The community of Grand Rapids was shocked learning that a trusted nurse and loyal friend had kidnapped a child and hidden her for 38 years while pretending to support the victim's family, and the betrayal was so profound that people struggled to comprehend it. Because Judith was dead, she could not be prosecuted, and there would be no trial, no public accounting of what she had done, only the documentation of her crime and the devastating impact on everyone involved, and that lack of justice felt like another cruelty. Helen was released from the hospital and returned home, and Mira stayed with her in the house on Lafayette Avenue, sleeping in her childhood bedroom that had been preserved for 38 years, surrounded by toys and clothes from a life she did not remember. The gap between them was enormous. They were strangers who happened to share DNA, and Helen wanted her 6-year-old daughter back, while Mira was a 44-year-old woman who had lived an entire life, and bridging that gap required patience and therapy and acceptance that their relationship would never be what it should have been. Mira grieved for Judith despite understanding what she had done. 38 years of love and care could not be erased by learning the truth, and she struggled with loving the woman who had destroyed her family, and her therapist said both feelings could coexist. Love and betrayal were not mutually exclusive. She also struggled with her name. She had been Emma for 38 years. That was the name she responded to, the name on her driver's license and bank accounts, and being called Mira felt foreign, and she eventually decided to legally become Mira Emma Langston Carver, acknowledging both identities. Owen tried to support his sister, but his anger at Judith made it difficult, and he struggled to understand how Mira could grieve for the woman who had kidnapped her, and family therapy helped him process his feelings and learn to separate Judith's crime from Mira's experience of being raised by her. The case attracted national media attention, and documentaries were produced about the best friend who kidnapped a child and maintained the deception for decades, and journalists wanted interviews, but Helen and Mira declined most requests, needing privacy to process the complicated emotions and build some kind of relationship. Mira began rebuilding her life and reconnecting with her biological identity, and she learned about the Langston family, about her father who had died, about Owen's career, about Helen's advocacy work, and she tried to understand the family she had been stolen from. The months following Mira's return were filled with painful adjustments, as she tried to navigate life with her biological family while processing the loss of the only mother she had known, and she found work as a medical transcriptionist, a quiet job that allowed her to process her emotions while maintaining independence. Helen struggled with conflicting feelings, joy that Mira was alive mixed with rage at Judith's betrayal, and grief that she had lost 38 years with her daughter, years that could never be recovered, milestones she had missed, and a relationship that felt broken before it began. She could not understand how she had never suspected Judith, how she had welcomed her into their home for decades, how she had trusted her completely, and the betrayal felt worse than the kidnapping itself because it had been sustained and deliberate, hidden behind friendship and concern. Owen became obsessed with reviewing the original investigation, looking for signs that should have revealed Judith's involvement, and he was furious that her alibi had been accepted so easily, that investigators had not pressed harder, that being the victim's best friend had made her seem beyond suspicion. He discovered that if investigators had checked hospital records more carefully, they would have seen Judith called in sick that day, that her supervisor's initial statement had been misrecorded, and that a simple verification would have exposed her lie, and he was angry at the system that had failed his sister. The Cabbage Patch doll that had been found in the parking garage in 1985 was submitted for DNA testing, and it confirmed Judith's DNA on the doll, along with Mira's, proving Judith had handled it, likely when she threw it in the trash to eliminate evidence. The doll Mira had found in Judith's attic was a different one, a replacement Judith had bought afterward, and she had kept it as a memento of the day she took Mira, and both dolls were now evidence of her crime, preserved in storage as testimony to her deception. Helen established a foundation in 2024 called the Mira Langston Trust Fund, dedicated to supporting adults who had been abducted as children and returned decades later, recognizing that reunification after such extreme time periods required specialized psychological support and resources. The foundation also advocated for better investigation protocols that did not automatically exclude suspects based on their relationship to victims, that questioned alibis more rigorously, and that recognized that perpetrators often inserted themselves into investigations to monitor progress and deflect suspicion. Mira became a reluctant spokesperson for the foundation despite her discomfort with attention, and she spoke at conferences about her experience, about being raised by her abductor, about the complicated grief of losing someone who committed a terrible crime but also loved and cared for you. She emphasized that Judith had been mentally ill, had been consumed by desperation and obsession, and while that did not excuse the kidnapping, it explained it, and she hoped her story would encourage better mental health intervention for people struggling with infertility and related trauma. The documentary about her case was released in 2025 titled The Friend Who Knew the Mira Langston Story, and it detailed Judith's deception, the decades she spent consoling Helen while raising Mira, and the letters that revealed her twisted justification for what she had done. The documentary sparked conversations about how abductors hide in plain sight, how people trust friends and family without questioning, how desperation can lead to terrible crimes, and how survivors carry conflicting emotions about their captors, especially when raised with apparent love despite the underlying crime. Helen's health declined in 2026 with heart problems and diabetes, and knowing her time was limited, she tried to spend as much time as possible with Mira, telling her about her early childhood, about the girl she had been before Judith took her. She showed Mira home videos from the early 1980s, footage of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, and Mira watched herself as a toddler and young child, trying to recognize that little girl with curly brown hair who became Emma and was now trying to become Mira again. Helen died peacefully in her sleep in November 2027 at age 77, and Mira was devastated. She had just found her mother after 38 years and lost her after only 4, and she spoke at the funeral about Helen's strength, her decades of searching, her grace in accepting a damaged relationship. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery beside David, and Mira visited the grave weekly, bringing flowers and talking to parents she barely remembered, about learning to forgive Judith, about building a relationship with Owen, about trying to make peace with a life fractured by one terrible December day. Owen and Mira grew closer over time, and they met regularly for coffee, and they talked about Judith and their parents and the family they might have been, and they built a relationship that honored both the siblings they had been and the adults they had become, despite decades of separation. Mira continued therapy into her late 40s, working through layers of trauma and identity confusion, and her therapist said she was grieving multiple losses: her childhood, her biological family, her sense of who she was, and Judith, who despite everything had been her mother for 38 years. The story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it. And if stories like this move you, if you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA and advancing technology, subscribe to the DNA Archives, where new stories are shared every day. It's free, and it helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice after decades of silence. And it reminds us that predators hide behind friendship and trust, that mental illness can drive terrible crimes, and that some betrayals are so profound they reshape entire families across generations. Mira Langston was 6 years old when she vanished from a Michigan toy store at Christmas, taken by her mother's best friend, who had comforted the family while raising her as Emma Carver, and she lived 38 years believing a lie about who she was until Judith's death revealed the truth, not as a tragedy alone, but as a testament to resilience and the complexity of love and betrayal, as proof that some abductors are the last people anyone suspects, as inspiration for investigating those closest to victims, and as validation that survivors can grieve their abductors while understanding the crime. Her Cabbage Patch doll preserved the DNA that confirmed Judith's involvement, and that doll waited 38 years until Mira found the twin kept in an attic box. And in the end, the truth emerged not through investigation, but through death releasing secrets, proving that some lies collapse only when the liar can no longer maintain them, and some families reunite only to discover the damage is too profound to fully heal. But healing is possible even when wholeness is not.